طيب يعطيكم العافية. راح نحكي اليوم إن شاء الله عن الجزء الأخير من محاضرات الميديسينال كيمستري اللي هو الأنتي فانجل دراجز أو الأنتي فانجل ايجنتس. قبل ما نحكي عن أنتي فانجل ايجنتس نحكي شو الفنجاي، شو الفنجل انفكشن. الفنجاي هو عبارة عن eukaryotic organisms. They have a DNA enclosed in a nucleus، جوا nucleus داخل غلاف النيوكليوس، وموجود فيها السيل ممبرين وسيل وول، فيها cytoplasm. And there is a lot of similarities between the fungal cell and human cells or the mammalian cells. And so basically, because the mammalian cell too, they have a DNA, they have a nucleus, they have cytoplasm, they have cell membrane. All of these are shared between the two things, the fungus and the human or the mammalian cells. That's why treatment of fungal infection is not that easy, because they're also a eukaryotic. So they're usually difficult to treat, specifically if there's systematic infection. And a topical infection or superficial infection is much easier to treat, because you expect your antifungal drugs to not be able to reach systematic circulation and cause severe side effects. But systematic fungal infections are one of the hardest to treat, and basically they can cause severe complication and could result in the death of the patient. طيب هلا as we said, the reason why they're difficult to treat because there is a similarities, many biochemical similarities, especially in the cell membrane between the mammalian cell and the fungal cell. That's why that antifungal agents could kill fungus and be toxic to human cells at the normal doses being used. Again, في some type of differences between fungus and human cells that can be targeted sometimes. And the main target of these drugs usually is something related to the sterols of these two different organisms. So, الليبيد بايلر اللي موجود اللي هو جزء من السيل membrane, they're usually unstable themselves, which means they need some type of a stiffening agent, يعني some type of a compound that will add stiffness to the cell membrane. لأنه الليبيد بايلر يعني زي كأنهم oily material, so you need to make them more stiff to get the shape of the cell, the circular shape of the cell. So sterols are compounds that are embedded in this phospholipid bilayer or lipid bilayer to act as a stiffening agent. الستيروls موجود بالhuman cells والfungal cells as well. In human cells the sterols are cholesterol, بينما بالfungal cell they're called ergosterol. شو الاختلافات بينهم؟ الاختلافات very simple. There's not much difference. The main difference is basically this is the structure of ergosterol, and the ergosterol has a double bond at carbon 22 and 23. Between 22 and 23 there's a double bond. بينما هنا بالcholesterol there's no double bond over here, and there is no double bond as well in ring B. And so these are the main differences in the structure. So they're very similar in a way or another, that they sit between the two phospholipid bilayer. And you can see this hydroxyl is the polar head, and then this is the non-polar side. So they are kind of amphoteric compounds, amphopathic compounds, where they have the polar and non-polar moieties, and the polar moiety is the hydroxyl, while the non-polar moiety is the rest of the structure. So it's mostly non-polar. You can see it fits between the lipid bilayer. Lipid bilayer has a non-polar side chain, this long hydrocarbon chain, and the phosphate, which is polar, that can interact with the hydroxy. So the hydroxy interact with the phosphate, and the rest of the lipid part of these sterols interact with the phospholipid or the lipid part, or the hydrocarbon chain of the lipid part, when it sits inside these cell membranes. طيب again شو وظيفة الارجوستيرولز والكوليسترول سواء كانت بالhuman cells أو بالfungal cells؟ They are working as stiffening agent. They work as stiffening agent for these cell membranes. طيب شو different types of human fungal infection, or the fungal infection that can get human? Fungal infection is called mycosis. The human fungal infection, or the fungal infection itself, is named as mycosis, the medical name. It can be systematic, which means the disease is really inside your body and inside the tissues that are inside the body. And these systematic mycoses have a heterogeneous etiology. They are, for example, an opportunistic fungal infections that target, for example, a lot of those immunocompromised patients. Criminal immunocompromised, so on, cancer patient or HIV patient can get systematic mycosis. It's very rare to happen. You don't see much of systematic mycosis. It's typically more of a localized fungal infection, usually superficial or subcutaneous. But if it happens systematic, there is usually an underlying condition that the reason for this systematic infections, and usually it's an immunocompromised. And the most type of fungus that causes this is a type of yeast which is called Candida or Candida albicans. This Candida albicans can cause mycosis or fungal infection, whether it's located systematic or superficial, doesn't matter. And you see a lot of those Candida infections for example, also the women that take contraceptives, they often predispose a patient to infection by Candida species due to those hormonal changes. And there is also sometimes bowel superinfection that's caused by those Candida species, specifically when we use a very wide spectrum antibiotic orally, then that could cause superinfection by those Candida species. And this is basically because of this wide spectrum antibiotic kills those normal flora bacteria, allow opportunistic fungus to come and grow inside this bowel, and so you can have a super infection in the bowel as well. Sometimes you see oral candidiasis, and oral candidiasis is common in poorly nourished persons, يعني الاشخاص اللي ما بيعتنوا بالهايجين تبع الماوث, and in patients that are immunosuppressive, that use immunosuppressive drug, or immune compromised patients, their AIDS with cancer patients. So these opportunistic type of Candida fungus can affect persons mostly who are fairly immunocompromised. But also the most common type of fungal infection اللي هو superficial cutaneous infection. This is the most common type of human fungal disease, and these are caused by relatively homogeneous group of fungus that are called dermatophytes or dermatophytosis. That's what they cause the fungal infection. They are superficial infection على الكيراتينized epidermis, على الجزء الخارجي من السkin, and for example they can affect this part of the skin, or they can affect the hair or the hair follicle themselves and the nails and so on. And a lot of times these superficial mycoses, the causative microbes are specialized type of spirophytes that have unusual ability to digest the keratinine in the skin, and so they're different than these راح نشوفهم subcutaneous fungal infections in the way they are easily transmitted. An example in those اللي هم الاتhlete foods that are caused by teeny species of those fungus, as you all know. وهذا الحكي يمكن أخذتوه more in details in pharmacology and other places. طيب هلا ال third part that could also be considered as part of human mycosis اللي هو subcutaneous fungal infection. And the subcutaneous mycosis refers to a group of fungal diseases. They are heterogeneous group of fungal diseases in which both the skin and the subcutaneous tissue are both involved, but typically there is now again overgrowth to disseminate to go to the internal organs. So they stay localized in the subcutaneous tissue in the same area where they are in. So, as to summarize the slide, we have three types of human mycosis. We have systematic mycosis, the rarest one, superficial or cutaneous infection, very common, زي الأثليتيك food واللي بيصير caused by teeny species, or زي sometime in diaper rash that happens in the kids and so on. السبكيوتانيوس fungal infection, an example of this اللي هو بيصير فعليا السبكيوتانيوس tissue and the subcutaneous tissue. طيب إذا شفنا different types, we summarize them. Now let's talk about the antifungal agents that we use, and we have different type of classes of antifungal agents that are classified according to their structure usually. So we have the azoles, an example of them اللي هو الكيتوكونازول, itraconazole, fluconazole, كلهم هذول بنعرفهم azole بنتوا بالازول. These are antifungal agents. We have an antibiotic type of antifungal agents زي الانفوتيريسين B, and these are large macrolide-like structure فعليا بيشبه الماكرولايز in terms of their large cyclic structures, lactone structures, cyclic ester structures that have a lot of double bonds and hydroxy in their structures. راح نشوف examples عليهم a little bit later. The third one اللي هو الاليلامين. An example of this اللي هو التربينافين. والlast one اللي هم البيريميدين زي الفلوسايتوسين. هم عبارة عن antimetabolites typical للانتي-cancer as we learned in the anti-cancer agents, but they target the fungus and the growth of that fungus. The first group اللي نحكي عنها اللي هو azole antifungals. ومن اسمهم الازول they have an azole group. And what is the azole group? Are a class of 5-member heterocyclic compounds that contain nitrogen atom at least and at least one nitrogen atom or more. So these are azoles. Azoles can be two nitrogens. For example, in this case, it's called imidazole. If you have two nitrogens at nitrogen number 1, هيك الترقيم بتم 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at 1 and 3, then this is called imidazole if you have two nitrogen. If you have in this X and a third nitrogen, then this is called as triazole. It's called as triazole. So these azole antifungal agents are all synthetic compounds, and there is an older generation and a newer generation. The older generation, all of them have this imidazole structure, اللي هو two nitrogens in this ring. بينما newer generation all contain the triazole. لأنه they found that triazole make them more selective to those fungal cells, more selective to targeting the fungal enzymes. اللي هنحكي عنه a little bit later. And so these are the more of commonly used nowadays اللي هم triazole compounds. الاميدازول example عليهم زي clotrimazole, ketoconazole, miconazole. وعندنا triazole compounds اللي هم المور recent اللي بنسمعهم أكثر بالماركت زي الفلوكونازول, itraconazole, and poriconazole. This is an example على الاميدازول containing antifungals اللي هم زي الclotrimazole. You can see this is the imidazole ring, and this nitrogen is usually substituted with either 3 or 2 aromatic rings that will increase the lipophilicity of that structure. طيب هلا عشان نعرف كيف هدول الكومباوندز work, we have to see how the ergosterol, which is the sterol that's being built inside the fungus or used inside the fungus, basically for building the cell membrane. الارجسترول حكينا was working as stiffening agent. طيب كيف بنصنع الارجسترول inside the fungus? This is done through starting with the squalene, which gets epoxide, which gets with an enzyme, react with an enzyme that's called squalene epoxidase, and where we oxidize this first double bond at carbon number 2 with this enzyme squalene epoxidase to form an epoxide. The formation of this epoxide allowed to do what we call the cyclization reaction, the sequential cyclization reaction, which is one of the most fascinating reactions that happens inside the body. That you have these aliphatic or linear compound turn into tetracyclic compound, compound that has four cyclic rings. So this is done once you have the epoxide. This goes through an enzyme, a second enzyme that's called squalene epoxidase, squalene epoxide cyclase, which allows the attack of this double bond on the epoxide to make the first 6-member ring, then followed by a second double bond attack to make this B ring, a third double bond attack on to make the C ring, and then a third one or the fourth attack from this double bond to make the D ring. All of these cyclization reaction happens stereoselectively, so you'll see one enantiomer being produced of that compound, although you have multiple enantiomers that can be produced because you have different stereocenters. But because of this enzyme, it's a stereoselective reaction that allows cyclization, or what we call a rearrangement of these double bonds to cyclize into 4 rings, which is the steroid core structure or the sterol core structures. This is called as lanosterol. This is the parent compound for most of the hormonal steroidal hormones and many other steroid compounds that we have in our body. Now lanosterol goes to further steps by the fungal cells as well, where we have this lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase, and this demethylase فعليا بيشيل one methyl group. Now there is a mistake in this slide, but you should be able to tell which one is carbon number 14 by numbering the steroid core structure. وهذا numbering مطلوب منك انك تعرفه. And so it says lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. So where's the methyl at carbon number 14 that will be removed? It is over here. This is the methyl that you remove over here. So in the next structure في خطأ هون لازم يتعدل انه هاي الميثيل فعليا لازم تكون hydrogen. So this methyl is being removed by this lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. This is basically a demethylation reaction. وإذا أخذته medicinal 1 كيف يصير demethylation? It's typically happen with those enzymes that are similar to cytochrome B. So there is an oxidation step of this methyl happens that allows to demethylate this carbon. And this is an oxidation reaction فعليا. Oxidative demethylation that happens. ولو أخذته بالميديسينال 1 بتشوفوا one of the metabolic pathways for many of the drugs اللي هو demethylation. It's done by oxidative pathway or oxidative demethylation. ويا رجاء انكم تعرفوا كيف oxidative demethylation happen او oxidative dealkylation happen through those cytochrome B enzymes, because this is the same exact mechanism where we remove this methyl by oxidative reaction or oxidative step. So these are lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. Now with many more steps, this goes from dimethyl lanosterol to the ergosterol. The steps we're not interested in, but we are interested specifically in this enzyme lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. ليش؟ لأنه this is where the azole compound works. They basically attack or target this lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase enzyme. They inhibit the formation of the conversion of this lanosterol to the demethylated lanosterol. And so they inhibit the synthesis of ergosterol. So where exactly those azole working? They inhibit this enzyme lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. And this is an oxidative dealkylation. That's why you need an oxygen. So they inhibit this enzyme and they inhibit the synthesis of ergosterol in fungal cells. Now we do make not ergosterol, we do make cholesterol in our human mammalian cells. And so we need the same synthetic strategy فعليا موجودة بالجسم, وعندنا lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase موجود as an enzyme in our body. But this is also supposed to be more selective for those lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase اللي هم موجودين بالفانجل. طيب خلينا نطلع مور على الميكانيزم والديتيلز تبع الميكانيزم عشان نعرف كيف الانهبيشن هذا lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase happens. So lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase, as we said, انه عبارة عن oxidative enzyme زي cytochrome P450. هو جزء من cytochrome P450 class enzymes. So that enzyme, it does demethylation by by basically an oxidation reaction. So this enzyme is the target for those azoles or azole antifungal compounds. حكينا اللانوستيرول موجود كمان بجسم الإنسان بس هو موجود بالفنجل and it's a different shape than this one. So these are cytochrome P450. And the azoles inhibit those cytochrome P450 اللي هم lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase through their nitrogen and their most basic pair of nitrogen or the nitrogen they have. And if you look at what they do, these basic nitrogens chelate with the iron in the binding pocket. There is an iron in the binding pocket. This is part of the oxidation. And the وظيفة iron or function of the iron is basically to activate the oxygen, molecular oxygen عشان تحول الأكسجين radical kind of a compound that can do the oxidation على double bond أو oxidation على carbon to remove it or to do a dealkylation step. So to simplify things, this is the structure of مثلا نحكي الأزولز specifically عن الإميدازول. تمام. So we have two nitrogens. We have this nitrogen over here. This is nitrogen number 1. This is nitrogen number 3. Which one is the most basic one? This is the most basic nitrogen. This is the one over here, which is the one that's at number 3. So this is the one that's going to chelate with the iron that's inside the binding pocket of that اللي هو اللاينوستيرول. أنا راح أختصر الاسم فقط من باب اختصاره. I can't just draw the whole thing. 14 alpha demethylase. So Elanosterol طبعا هنا an R because there is a bulky large hydrophobic group over here. So the Elanosterol has an iron inside it, and that iron or heme moiety is necessary to activate the molecular oxygen and to make this oxidation reaction or dealkylation reaction happen. تمام? So it can activate this oxygen to do an oxidation or remove this alkyl group. Like in what the imidazole do and azole compounds in general, basically they have a basic nitrogen. Their most basic nitrogen in case of imidazole is this one, and then it kills with the iron, prevent this oxidation step to happen by preventing this activation of molecular oxygen. So the function of these compounds is basically inhibit this cholesterol 14 alpha demethylase by inhibiting this binding to this iron, chelating with it, and inhibiting this oxidation step. طيب. So what happens لما يصير عندنا prevention for this 14 alpha demethylase enzyme or inhibition of that enzyme, we're not able to build the ergosterol that fungal cells need to build their cell membrane. So you get a liquidish kind of cell membrane that allow the passage of liquid and water and ions and so on. So it destroys the cell membrane and it causes fungal cell death. How selective are these compounds? These compounds, as we said, this compound is selective, mostly selective to fungal Elanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. They can target the human one, but at much higher concentration. So they do inhibit the synthesis of ergosterol, but they can inhibit the synthesis of cholesterol as well, and that results in an inhibition of synthesis of cholesterol and other necessary steroidal enzymes موجود أو steroidal hormones موجودة بالجسم if we use very high concentration of those compounds. What we should know that the triazole, مش الإميدازole, appear to be more selective to the fungal cytochrome P450 elanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. That's why you see less side effects with the triazoles زي fluconazole, itraconazole حكينا عنهم newer generation, because their triazoles is more selectively inhibiting the enzyme demethylase enzyme اللي موجود بالfungal cells. So they have a lower incidence of endocrine effect اللي هم يعني أي تأثير على الهرمونال endocrines وأي تأثير على hepatotoxicity. So by these enzymes is less in case of triazole compared to imidazole. تمام? So that's why the triazoles are the newer generation basically. طيب. What are the resistance mechanisms that fungal can basically use to reduce the effect of those antifungal agents? One thing is basically they بيعملوا mutation بالbinding pocket to protect the heme, and so they make the binding less efficient of these azoles, elanosterol 14 alpha. The second thing is the azole efflux. Basically, they can generate some type of PGP proteins that kick out those azoles. And the third one is that sometimes they increase production of the C14 sterol demethylase, and that will compensate for the inhibited ones. So these are the three resistance mechanisms. Okay. The last question that we have is حكينا هون بالimidazole, this is the most basic nitrogen. I'm gonna leave it for you as a homework to find in triazole which one is the most basic nitrogen in triazole. And if you know, then you should be able to tell which one is the one that binds to the cytochrome B450 and inhibit those elanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. So الhomework عليك انك تعرف انه which nitrogen is the most basic nitrogen in triazole and the one that binds to the heme moiety inside this elanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. Okay. طيب هلا إذا بنطلع على structure activity relationship of these antifungal agents, The most important thing to know that the basic structure requirement for these azoles is a weakly basic imidazole or triazole ring. سواء كانت imidazole فيها 2 nitrogen أو triazole, we need to have this core structure اللي هو imidazole أو triazole اللي موجود. And then the nitrogen اللي موجود على imidazole or triazole اللي هي nitrogen number 1 will have a link to a much larger hydrophobic part. تمام. So this imidazole triazole as we drew it previously فعليا خليني ارسمها هون فقط للتوضيح. If we look at this imidazole, so it's very necessary for activity as we said. وفعليا هاي النيتروجين راح تكون مرتبطة على large alkyl group. It's usually there is 2 or 3 aromatic rings are in this R فعليا أو الالكيل group اللي مرتبطة على النيتروجين. At least one of them will be halogen substituted. Fluorine is the best. Again, fluorine is a very, very effective atom in enhancing the bioactivity of these compounds and many other compounds we learned, the fluoroquinolones and so on. And so this is a non-polar moiety فعليا هاي الالكيل جروب، وعندنا هون relatively polar moiety اللي هي الاميدازول. Okay, so you can see these are the main structure activity relationship. هلا شو وظيفة اللارج non polar portion اللي حكينا عنه بالالكيل جروب؟ وظيفته هذا اللي هو الار large non polar اللي هو سواء 2 or 3 aromatic rings راح يكونوا موجودين is to mimic the non-polar steroidal part. هلا steroid as we can see there's 4 rings if we remember. These 4 rings are all فعليا highly polar moieties. And so basically you can see طبعا this is a 6-member ring, it's not an issue. طيب هلا you can see that this is a large hydrophobic part, these sterols. So to resemble this hydrophobic moiety in these imidazoles as we drew over here سابقا أو سواء triazoles أو imidazole في عندنا R group. This is an R to represent similarities to this sterols. So they are necessary to يعني mimic the sterol structure. هلا because of this large non-polar moiety اللي موجود بالazole, most of these azoles are basically not water soluble. So their free base is not water soluble and they need to be dissolved in organic solvents زي ethanol عشان if we want to give them to the patients. Now there is an exception for this اللي هو fluconazole. Fluconazole has 2 polar triazoles. So 2 polar triazoles will enhance the polarity of that compound, so it's sufficiently water soluble to be injected intravenous as a free base فعليا لأنه وجود 2 triazoles enhance this polarity. Otherwise كل الأزولز فعليا need to be dissolved in type of co-solvent to enhance their solubility. طيب خلينا نطلع على some agents that are used for as antifungal agents. حكينا imidazole or triazole. نبلش بالchlorotrimazole. Chlorotrimazole is a broad spectrum antifungal drug that's used typically for treatment of tinea infections and candidiasis. والتينيا اللي هي بتسبب الأثلت foot as we said earlier. This is the structure, large aromatic part. You have imidazole. This is one of the older generations as we said. مش فعليا مش a newer generation. And so this compound is used for treatment of those. This is a very old compound, not used much anymore because it causes severe gastrointestinal disturbance if it's given orally. It's extensively bound to protein as well, so it's not given systematically, it's not used systematically because of this. And it's not considered suitable for treatment of systematic infection. It's an old compound. The second compound is myconazole, and the myconazole is used for treatment of very serious systematic fungal infection. And it's not, it has a lot of side effects because of this imidazole, as we said. So it cannot be used systematically unless it's very severe mycosis, systematic mycosis, but it's used for treatment of vaginal candidiasis as a cream because it's topical. It doesn't need to be absorbed to do its effect, so there's much less chance of side effects. Ketoconazole is recommended for treatment of systematic infection in case of severe systematic infection because it's broad spectrum and it's orally active compound. And sometimes it's used for treatment of refractory cutaneous dermatophytic infection. وهي هاي اللي حكينا عنها هي عبارة عن يعني هي superficial فعليا، لكن لما تكون refractory صعب تتريت topically، بيكون في مناطق مختفي فيها الفنجس فبيضطروا يعطوا oral and in that case ketoconazole is the choice to be given. It's also used topically in cream and shampoos in the management of cutaneous candidiasis اللي زي القشرة اللي موجودة بالفانجل infections. And فعليا هنا it's important to know that this compound, if it needs to be given orally, it needs the stomach acidity for absorption. You need that stomach acidity. شو السبب? Because it's very lipophilic, so it's not easily soluble in water. So if you give it to the patient in a tablet, if it doesn't dissolve, you cannot absorb it. So you need the stomach acidity to proteinate this imidazole, and then after this it dissolves in water and then it can get absorbed. لذلك ما بصير نعطيهم usually مع anti acids because they reduce their bioavailability for these compounds. Okay. طيب لا الكيتوكونازول as well as we said, it's used mostly for serious systematic infection, and the most common are caused by the non-selectivity of ketoconazole because it's imidazole, فهو مش selective كتير وممكن يعمل لنا inhibition للhuman 14 لانسترول 14 alpha demethylase. طيب شو result of that? الكيتوكونازول first of all it can cause hepatotoxicity because of the inhibition of cytochrome B اللي موجود بالliver و other inflammatory effect that it could cause, so it can cause hepatotoxicity. كمان as we said, it inhibits human cholesterol 14 alpha demethylase, so it can inhibit the cholesterol synthesis and also inhibit those testosterone and corticosterone levels. So at higher concentration, it was reported that they could cause lower testosterone and corticosterone levels, reflecting the inhibition of the cytochrome P requiring enzymes involved in the human steroid hormonal biosynthesis. Okay, so these are the two important things. In addition to this, now, as we said, they inhibit the cytochrome P, سواء كانت لانستيرون 14 alpha demethylase or other cytochrome P's موجودين بالliver. So if this is ketoconazole given orally, you have to know that it's going to inhibit the cytochrome P اللي موجود بالliver, so it's going to reduce the first pass effect. That's why if these patients taking other medications that are affected highly by this first pass effect, زي cyclosporin, phenytoin, terfenadine, then you would expect the plasma concentration to increase significantly, and you would be worried about toxicity if these are two giving together simultaneously. So these are the three important things that I should know about ketoconazole. It inhibits cholesterol synthesis, could cause hepatotoxicity. Sometimes it reduces testosterone, corticosterone levels, and we have to be worried about drug-drug interaction with these cyclosporin, phenytoin, and terfenadine. The other compounds that we are going to talk about are the triazole generation, زي itraconazole or fluconazole. And we can see that these compounds are triazoles are, as we said, more selective fungal lanosterol 14 alpha demethylase. So they cause less hepatotoxicity فعليا. They're not hepatotoxic at all most of the time. And they don't cause adrenal or testicular suppression as we've seen earlier بالحالة الكومباوند اللي شفناها الكيتوكونازول سابقا. It's very commonly used nowadays. Fluconazole is much more safer than the previous generations زي الكيتوكونازول اللي شفناهم. And these, as we mentioned earlier, fluconazole is water soluble because of the presence of these two triazoles, so it makes it suitable for oral or even intravenous administration without the need for co-solvent. تمام؟ طيب إذن the two compounds that we're going to talk about here are itraconazole, fluconazole. Itraconazole is orally active, orally bioavailable. It's a broad spectrum antifungal agent. That's very important alternative for ketoconazole. So it's why very important alternative لأنه it's more effective and better tolerated than ketoconazole because it has this triazole structure, as you can see. And then the same thing applies for diflucan, which is or fluconazole. This is the trade name for that compound. It's very safe and effective and also easily dissolved for water or for oral or intravenous injection. The last one of these azole compounds اللي بدنا نحكي عنه اللي هو الvoriconazole, which is the most recent azole antifungal agents that's discovered. As we see here, it's another triazole compound, so it's safe, doesn't cause hepatotoxicity, it's more selective than fungal enzymes than human, so you don't see the side effects we saw earlier with ketoconazole. In addition to that, it has another pyrimidine ring. Now, voriconazole, they use fluconazole, except that it's much broader in terms of spectrum. So it kills a lot of clinically important pathogens, and voriconazole become more successfully used nowadays for treatment of various systematic infection and cutaneous as well as subcutaneous infection. طيب إذا أهم 3 compounds we learn about اللي هم itraconazole, voriconazole and fluconazole اللي فيهم التريازول ring as we mentioned earlier. خلينا نروح على ال second group of antifungal agents اللي هم زي ال polyenes. And the polyenes من اسمهم, these are compounds that contain a system of conjugated double bond in a macrocyclic lactone ring. هذا الاشي لازم مفروض يذكرك بشيء تعلمناه سابقا. كان في macrocyclic lactone ring وكان في double bonds اللي هم فعليا اذا بتتذكروهم الماكرولايت antibiotic. طيب شو بيختلفوا عن الماكرولايت؟ They're usually larger and contain a conjugated in system of double bonds, multiple double bonds, many double bonds conjugated. بينما بالماكرولايت we don't see this. هلا for these polyene structures are compounds that have macrocyclic lactone ring, contain a conjugated double bond, and they are very clinically useful. The clinically useful polyenes fall into one of the two groups, either depending on the size of that macrolide, either the 26-member ring or 38-member ring polyenes. 26-member ring أنا زي natamycin, or 38-member ring أنا زي amphotericin B, which is one of the most useful polyenes for a treatment of systematic infection, although it's still a toxic compound. These are not super selective compounds. And so the structure again هو عبارة عن large macrocyclic فيه double bonds وفيه جزء كمان series of hydroxyl groups as well, in addition to this deoxyaminohexose sugar unit that exists in mycosis. They're called, these deoxyaminohexoses are called mycosamine. هلا عدد الدبل بونز بالستراكشرز بيختلف كمان. حكينا انه الناتامايسين هو عباره عن 26 member ring، انفوتريسين بي 38 member ring. كمان الناتامايسين هو فيه بنتاين فيه 5 دبل بونز، النيستاتين فيه 6 دبل بوند، والانفوتريسين بي فيه 7 دبل بوند. هلا طيب البولينز also الكيمستري، خلينا نحكي شوي عن الكيمستري تبعتهم. هم they're used for treatment of systematic infection. The use for them to be for treatment of systematic infection is very limited by the issue of toxicity. These are toxic compounds in addition to their low water solubilities and poor chemical stabilities. These are 3 things that prevent their use for systematic infection or reduce the use of the systematic infection. من اللي حكيناهم سابقا النيستاتين والانفوترسين بي the only one that can be used for treatment of systematic infection اللي هو الانفوترسين بي. تمام. And this compound is, as we said, زيه زي other polyenes. It's very low water soluble, has a poor chemical stability, it has some toxicity. So it's only given, it has to be dissolved or solubilized with detergent and other co-solvent to be given for intravenous infusion. And it cannot be given for intramuscular لأنه intramuscular, if it's given to those patients by intramuscular, it can sit. هلا راح نشوف الميكانيزم. It can sit in the cell membrane of those intramuscular tissues, and it can cause severe inflammation in there and severe pain in the location of the site. So amphotericin B can only be given as slow intravenous infusion for the patients directly into the bloodstream. Doesn't need to sit in the tissues or cells and muscles. The other polyenes are only indicated for the use of superficial treatment of superficial fungal infection. طيب هلا إذا as we said, these compounds are not easily فعليا solubilized, and they cannot be given orally because of their large structure, not water soluble. So they're not orally bioavailable. They're only given for intravenous infusion, and the only one that can be used for intravenous infusion and oral systematic oral infection هو الانفوتيرسين B. طيب نطلع على mechanism of action. How does these compounds work? As we said, these are large. طلعوا كيف structure تبعهم, very large structures. So as we can see, these are very large structures, 38 or 26 member ring. And how do they inhibit the growth of these fungal
cells by basically, once they reach the fungal cell membrane, they sit inside the fungal cell membrane, two molecules of these polyenes, and allow a polar channel to form inside the cell membrane, which allow polar ions and water molecule to leak inside the fungal cell and kill the fungal cell. So what they do is there's, as we said, two molecules of these polyenes sit in front of each other. يعني بيدخلوا جوا السيل membranes وبيفتحوا زي ما نحكي chain or sorry channel inside this cell membrane, allowing for ions and polar substances to go inside, to leak inside this fungal cell and to kill the fungal cell. So how do they sit inside in the cell membrane? There is a hydrophobic part of this structure, as you can see, that contains the double bond اللي حكينا عنهم. عدد الدبل bond كان ب 5 6 7 depending on the structure. وفي عندنا جزء هنا فيه hydroxyes. الجزء اللي فيه double bonds راح تلاقيه دخل بالسيل ممبرين وعمل interaction مع الاورجوستيرول اللي موجود بالسيل ممبرين تبع الفنجل، hydrophobic interaction. والجزء اللي البولر ضل موجود برا. نفس الشيء بالستراكشر الثاني، جزء البولر ضل موجود فعليا outside. الجزء النون بولر عمل interaction مع النون بولر ergosterol moiety. واذا كان في هون امين بكون عامل interaction مع الهيد polar head of that ergosterol. اللي بيهمني انه نعرف انه two polar parts of the two compounds leave a polar channel inside here inside the cell membrane, which basically disrupt the osmotic integrity of the fungal membrane, result in a leakage of intracellular potassium, magnesium, sugar metabolites, and then cellular death. So they make basically a panel or a hole or a channel inside the cell membrane of these fungal cells, and sits there as a false membrane component. بيخربوا الممbrane, sits as a false membrane component, allow making this channel along for disruption of this osmotic integrity of the fungal cell. So one of them, as we said, the amphotericin B is the only one that can be used for treatment of systematic infection, and that amphotericin B اللي هو known as fungizone as well. There's many other names موجودة بالماركت. هلا اللي بيهمني تعرف, as we said, amphotericin B is a polyene, can be used for treatment of systematic infection. It's given IV only. It cannot be given by intramuscular injection لأنه حكينا it can disturb the human cells integrity, osmotic integrity, and it cause يعني death for area of that injection in the muscular tissue, and so it can cause severe pain and inflammation in the location of that. So it's only given by IV infusion, and it's very toxic. As we said, all of these polyenes are very toxic compounds. About 80% of the patients that given those amphotericin B develop nephrotoxicity, fever, headache, anorexia, GI distress, malaise, muscles and joint pain are very common in those patients. So the drug is not very easily used specifically in terms of nephrotoxicity, which is very dangerous. That's why companies worked on a formulation of this compound to enhance the solubility and to reduce nephrotoxicity. And they found that there is a liposomal formation or liposomal formula that was mixed with amphotericin B, resulted in a better solubility of that compound, reduced nephrotoxicity that we have seen. And so this is the نحكي اللي هو micelles like structure that contain phospholipid bilayer, and then inside this phospholipid bilayer there is embedded amphotericin B molecules. And this is a phospholipid, as we all know. There is a polar head outside and there is a non-polar alkyl chain inside. So the non-polar alkyl chain زي sandwich موجود فعليا. Inside it will be these amphotericin B molecules. Okay, so that liposomal formation or liposomal formula of this amphotericin B resulted in two improvements. أول شيء إنه السوليبيليتي تحسن هذا الكومباوند for IV injection, and the second thing it reduces the toxicity and nephrotoxicity. كيف الراشونال it reduced nephrotoxicity? The rationale, very simple, is that amphotericin B should have a greater affinity for the lipid vehicle than for the cholesterol بالcell membrane لما يجي يقرب على الcell membrane, and so that reduces toxicity for those kidney cells and doesn't cause nephrotoxicity. Second compound اللي هو nystatin, and as this is used only topically, not absorbed systematically, it's too toxic to be administered parenterally, and so it's only used for typical treatment of fungal infections, as well as sometimes used for GI infections. If you have a severe local GI infections caused by the Candida albicans, then it can be used for treatment. And next compound اللي هو natamycin, and this natamycin compound, as we said, it has it has 5 double bonds, and it's a large macrolide ring with these deoxyaminohexose units. And this compound is given for ophthalmic suspension for treatment of fungal conjunctivitis, pylpharitis, and keratitis. طيب هيك بنكون خلصنا البوليينز. نحكي عن اللاست تو جروبز اللي هم الاليلامينز، واخر واحد اللي هو الانتي ميتابولايتس. الاليلامينز من اسمهم these compounds are basically allylamines. لما نحكي كلمة allyl, this is the allyl group over here. These are allyl moieties, double bond وجنبها carbon. These are called allyl, and this is the amine. Allylamines, as you know, or you might know maybe, these compounds interfere with the early step in orgosterol biosynthesis. They basically inhibit an enzyme that we call squalene epoxidase. إذا بتتذكروا لما حكينا عن synthesis of orgosterol، أول step بالسynthesis اللي هي نعمل epoxidation للsqualene by an enzyme called squalene epoxidase. And this allylamine inhibit the squalene epoxidase enzyme by competing with squalene. بيعمل competition مع السqualene، بيرتبطوا على الانزيم وبيمنع يصير epoxidation للسqualene عشان ما يكون لنا اللانوستيرول. And so basically squalene epoxidase is inhibited for those allylamines، والallylamines بيصير عليهم epoxidation. وين راح يصير epoxidation فعليا؟ راح يصير على الدبل بوند، هاي راح تتحول as epoxide instead of this double allylamine. So لما يروح على squalene epoxidase enzyme راح ينتج عندنا هذا البرودكت. I'm gonna draw it over it. This is an epoxide product. So these epoxides products compete just with the formation of this squalene epoxide, and so these epoxides are essential للسqualene عشان نقدر نحول squalene للانوستيرول. So if you يعني stop or compete with this step, then you reduce the formation of orgosterol by inhibition of that squalene epoxidase, and that destabilizes the fungal cell membrane. So they also, there's a nice thing about these allylamines that they very weakly inhibit mammalian squalene epoxidase, so they're not going to cause much toxicity. طيب هلا بس للتذكير، وين الستيب هاي سكوالين ايبوكسيديز؟ هي اول ستيب بالسينثيس اوف orgosterol لما نحول سكوالين لسكوالين epoxide. So if you inhibit that enzyme, you prevent formation of squalene epoxide, so you prevent formation of orgosterol. في عندنا examples عليهم على الاليلامينز. عندنا naftalene or naphthene. Where's the allylamine moiety? You should be able to see where's the allylamine moiety. This is your allylamine moiety over here, and this is where you're gonna see an epoxide formation. طبعا double bond راح تروح تصير single bond, and this is by squalene epoxide enzyme. These compounds compete with the squalenes, prevent squalene from oxidizing, being epoxid, يعني يصير له oxidation or epoxidation by squalene epoxidase. This compound is supplied as a cream or gel for topical treatment. And the second compound is terbinafine. Terbinafine, again, where is the allylamine moiety? This is the allylamine moiety. This is the allyl group over here, and this is the amine. So these are allylamine compounds that has oral and topical formulation. So this compound is used for oral and topical treatment of fungal infections. Okay. Now the important thing to know about terbinafine is also these are both of them are synthetic compounds. بس هذا موجود منه oral formula. These are highly lipophilic compounds, so if they're given orally, they're going to accumulate in the skin, nails, fatty tissues, and they're gonna have a long half-life. And this is very good because you want them to go there for those fungal infections اللي موجودة بالskin والnail والfatty tissue.
طيب the last compound we're gonna talk about in the allylamine اللي هو التولنا tolnaftate, and this compound, it doesn't have really an allylamine in there, but it is classified with allylamines because it inhibits the same enzyme, those choline epoxidase, and it has spectrum activity similar to that of allylamines since they are classified with these allylamines compounds. The last family of antifungal agents اللي هنحكي عنهم اللي هم antimetabolites, and the main compound that we're going to talk about اللي هو الفلوcytosine. And this compound is a prodrug that's activated basically by deamination within the fungal cells to produce 5-fluorouracil, and this enzyme necessary to do this is called cytosine deaminase. This enzyme is necessary to convert this cytosine to 5-fluorouracil. And if you remember حكينا عن 5-fluorouracil أهمية كيف يشتغل 5-fluorouracil في human cells. The same thing in 5-fluorouracil work in fungal cells. They inhibit the thymidylate enzyme, thymidylate synthase enzyme via formation of 5-fluorodeoxyuridine monophosphate اللي هو حكينا nucleotide of that 5-fluorouracil. And they interfere with the fungal DNA synthesis, so they have very similar mechanism what they work with the 5-fluorouracil in human cells. بس إنما structure تبعه it's a prodrug need to be activated by cytosine deaminase, which is يعني more active in the fungal cells, and that's why you see some more selectivity toward fungal cells rather than human cells when they form the 5-fluorouracil inside the fungal cells. Cytosine is administered orally. There is a lot of resistance have developed by fungus toward this compound, and that's why it's not favored. The use of it is not favored that much. The main targets for this resistance is basically that the transport system becomes impermeable. This is one thing. The cytosine deaminase is another point at which resistance occur, where this enzyme mutate itself عشان يعمل activation للفلوcytosine to 5-fluorouracil. And the problem is that basically these resistance mechanisms unfortunately develop very rapidly and quickly. One of the fastest ways, one of the fastest antifungal agents to develop resistance against flowcytosine with these antimetabolites. After just a few dosing intervals, the drug essentially becomes useless. One way to reduce this issue, if we want to do so, is to prolong the effect of flowcytosine with the use of polyene زي الانفوتيريسين بي اللي حكينا عنه سابقا. Antifungals B راح يسهل دخول هذول الدراجز للفنجل سيلز لانه بيعمل هول، وهي الهول بتسمح للفلوسايتوسين تدخل كمان. So it يعني overcome the impermeability issue for resistance, but still you could see resistance through cytosine deaminase. So there's a synergistic effect between amphotericin B and flowcytosine can be used to reduce resistance against flowcytosine. The last compound اللي بنحكي عنه اللي هو just a miscellaneous antifungal agent. It's called as rezafungin. It inhibits fungal mitosis. وأنا بدي أطلب منك تعرف a name of anti-cancer agents that inhibit fungal mitosis. There's a lot of them, but give me one of those names. And these fungal mitosis inhibitory effect work by disrupting the mitotic spindle formation through interaction with the polymerized microtubules. في مشهور في anti-cancer drug مشهور works in the same mechanism. But it's important to look at the structure. This is a unique structure. It doesn't have any of the features اللي حكينا عنه. لا هو polyene، لا هو allylamine، لا هو زي الانتيميتابولايت، ولا هو فعليا زي أول جروب اللي هو azole. So these are unique. This is a very unique compound miscellaneous agent used for treatment of systematic fungal infection as well as اللي هو topical fungal infections. طيب الدواء الأخير اللي راح نحكي عنه اليوم بهاي المحاضرة اللي هو rezafungin. Rezafungin is a drug that's called Rezayo, وهو دواء developed by a company that's called Sidara Therapeutics. Company is a startup company كانت موجودة بسان دييغو، وكانت هي عبارة عن مجموعة أشخاص يعني كانوا مخلصين دكتوراه جديد، اجتمعوا وعملوا شركة على دواء على هذا الدواء اللي عملوا له ديفلوبمنت بجامعة يونيفرسيتي اوف كاليفورنيا سان دييغو. طبعا الدواء أخذ FDA approval ب 2023 very recently مارش 2023 شهر 3. for the treatment of candidemia and invasive candidiasis, or specifically others that have no other alternative treatment options because it has some strong side effects. الكانديديميا اللي هم الأشخاص اللي بصير عندهم كانديد عندهم infection بكانديدا في البلد, and this is one of the most common fungal infections, systematic fungal infections, especially for patients that have either immunity suppression issues زي ال HIV patients أو they could be going through major surgeries زي القلب المفتوح أو تغيير صمامات أو so on, وبنتج عنه infection, systematic infection في بعض الأحيان بتكون بالعادة candida infection that we call it as candidemia. The drug is one of the options that now is being used for treatment of those candida patients, and it's relatively effective drug that can be used for those type of patients. The drug belongs to a class of compounds that called as Echinocandins, and these Echinocandins work through the inhibition of the synthesis of beta-glucan in the fungal cell wall through non-competitive inhibition of an enzyme that's called glucagon synthase enzyme. That enzyme is called beta-glucan synthase enzyme. So these drugs, I didn't talk about them because they're not very commonly used for treatment of fungal infection, except in the case where there is systematic fungal infection. The drug has a very big advantage. It has exceptional stability and solubility and very half-life compared to previously approved drug from the same class. If you look at the structure, you can see it has a macrocyclic peptide, which means a peptide with a large macrocycle ring, and it has a lipophilic chain. وإذا بتتذكروا حكينا المحاضرة الماضية عن الأوزمبيك السيماغلوتايد في long hydrocarbon chain. That long hydrocarbon chain assists in increasing the half-life through enhancing the binding to protein. About 99% of this drug is bound to protein once it's administered by injection, and so basically the drug will be released slowly over time like a sustained release form from albumin, and that will extend the half-life of this drug. This drug is an improvement over a well-known drug developed by Pfizer, which was called as Antifungals, which is another drug that was used for treatment of candidemia. If you look at the structure, they're very similar structure. The main difference is basically, which is one specific change was done on this 1,2-dihydroxy moiety, which was the reason for quick degradation of this anidulafungin compound that have a short half-life, about 20 some hours. بينما هذا الكومباوند its days half-life تبعه days around 7 days usually. So if you look at this compound, anidulafungin is a compound that degrades through spontaneous degradation or enzymatic degradation to open the ring, and by collapsing this hydroxy to release that, break this bond between this nitrogen and carbon, and this would call it ring opening, followed by other type of degradation. بس مهم تعرف انه بصير في عندنا ring opening on this specific part where the two hydroxys attached جنبهم النيتروجين. طيب, what did they do in this modification in rezafungin to improve the activity and the half-life of antilofungin was to add an alkyl-like chain فيها quaternary amine, that just to improve the solubility of this quaternary amine. But that alkylation of this hydroxy over here prevented this ring opening or reactive ring opening and the degradation of this product. So there is no degradation observed through this pathway, and this compound has a very long half-life, would be administered once a week only for the patients. بينما هذا it has to be given every day or once every day. So this compound, the main advantage is the long half-life, stability تبعته أحسن, والsolubility تبعته أحسن بسبب وجود الquaternary ammonium. So this is a big improvement over the well-known compound antilofungin that's developed by Pfizer. Cidara Therapeutics was able to get this FDA approved in 2023, which is one of the most recent drugs that's currently used for treatment of fungal infections. هيك بنكون خلصنا محاضرات fungal infections, محاضرة الفنجل infections يعني, وإن شاء الله تكونوا استفدتوا فيها ويعطيكم العافية.